before the British could react, Jackson's troops were among them, fighting with anything that could be used as a weapon.
Jackson attacked. In a pitch black dark, there was no moon. And what ensued was a melee. Whether it was rifle butts, rifle fire, swords, knives, fists, rocks, guns, strangling hands.
This was not the kind of warfare the British expected. They were accustomed to fighting in daylight, charging in waves that intimidated their enemy. But these were guerrilla-type tactics. After the successful surprise attack, Jackson pulled back and moved to fortify the city's major defenses. Jackson planned to stop the British by taking advantage of the canals, swamps, and terrain surrounding New Orleans. He chose to make his stand 1 mile north of the British camp, which put his army between the city and the enemy, with a river and a swamp protecting his flanks. A drainage canal provided the perfect position to build a parapet, a wall of earth and wood, which could hopefully be built strong enough to repel the most vicious British attack. Jackson ordered his militia to start digging trenches.
Faster, men! Faster!
Under Jackson's stern direction, his parapet fortification began to take shape. Slaves and soldiers worked day and night, side by side. Dirt, dug to form the trench, became a mound to support the parapet, reinforced with wood. The trench itself was filled with water to form a 10-foot wide moat. 4 days passed. Jackson had no idea when the Redcoats would charge his parapet. He kept watch from the second floor of a plantation house, thanks to a telescope given him by a local astronomer. At night, he continued his guerrilla-style attacks, sending Indians and militia sharpshooters to pick off British sentries.
This constant irritation and stinging operations that would come at you kept you on edge night and day. It was awful. It was very hard on the nerves and on the temperament, and it's really demoralizing.
The British reaction to this was to send a note to Jackson that this behavior was ungentlemanly. And Jackson's response to that was that it was ungentlemanly for the British to be occupying American soil and they should go back where they came from.
On December 28, 1814, 5 days after the Redcoats landed, they first tested Jackson's defensive line. The maneuver began with the British firing newly developed Congreve rockets.
It was really a glorified bottle rocket. The British brought them down to New Orleans thinking these poor bumpkins from Louisiana have never seen one of these, and if we shoot off enough of them, they're going to turn and run. In fact, the consensus among the Americans was that they thought they were rather pretty.
The initial British offensive lasted less than 3 hours. Small cannons and muskets fired from a distance made no impact whatsoever on Jackson's wall. Pakenham withdrew to devise another plan. He ordered heavier cannons brought in from ships anchored offshore. On the morning of January 1st, 1815, Pakenham waited for a heavy fog to lift before unleashing his bombardment. The New Year's Day battle was, in reality, a duel of cannoneers. The famed, powerful British on one side, and a band of pirates on the other. Despite the heavier shot fired by the British naval guns, Jackson's parapet held firm. The aim of Jean Lafitte's pirate cannoneers proved incredibly accurate. The British had used barrels of sugar to fortify their batteries. Not a good idea.
When you hit a barrel of sugar with a cannonball, the sugar goes everywhere. Does not stop the cannonball, but also gets everywhere, including in the breeches of the cannons and in the firing holes and everywhere else, and melts. crystallizes or whatever sugar does when it gets really stressed. So the great artillery duel did not work for the British, and the Americans were greatly cheered to see the British run away from their guns or drag whatever they could of them off.
Pakenham was again forced to rethink his strategy. He had been reluctant to storm the American defenses because of the potential for high casualties. But the failed bombardment forced his hand. On the morning of January 8th, Jackson's troops watched with fear as wave after wave of redcoats marched toward the parapet.
Hold your fire, men.
Just before the British infantry came within range of Jackson's riflemen, Lafitte's cannons let loose on the approaching mass of redcoats with newly crafted types of ammunition.
The American artillery fire has this terrific, horrendous effect on the ranks of the British infantry as they come, just mowing down large numbers. The artillery, they're firing grape shot, they're firing just loose pieces of metal. It's anti-personnel stuff. And it wipes out dozens or hundreds of the British at a blow. The British keep coming, they keep coming.
Jackson managed to hold back his anxious sharpshooters until the last possible moment. Finally, he gave the command.
Fire!
Then they unleash this horribly punishing volley, one volley after another. In this case, it's the British ranks that break, and the British are forced to find shelter wherever they can.
Pakenham told his men not to rush the parapet until ladders were in place. He would order the launch of a Congreve rocket to signal a redcoat charge, but the smoke obscured his view. Finally, out of desperation, he gave the order.
Fire the rocket!
The redcoats ran directly into a ceaseless barrage of musket fire from Jackson's troops. No ladders were waiting for them. American sharpshooters opened up at near point-blank range on the British soldiers as they futilely tried to cross the moat and climb the earthen parapet.
Just then, a bullet struck General Pakenham in the leg, and right after that, another bullet struck Pakenham and killed him dead. So the British at that point were without any commanders of the general rank. The regimental commanders were not sure what to do.
In less than an hour, the British assault had completely disintegrated. Those who could ran for their lives. Others laid on the ground, using the bodies of dead comrades as barriers against the continued onslaught of American gunfire.
When that smoke finally drifted away, a horrendous scene revealed itself as a sea of red right before Jackson's rampart. It was the red coats of the British who had been killed. And a silence came over the battlefield because the Americans had stopped shooting.
When the Americans went out there, they couldn't believe what they saw. After they counted up the British killed, wounded, prisoners, the number was more than 2,000. When they counted up their own casualties, killed, wounded, captured, it was about 24.
Jackson and his army of misfits had achieved what the U.S. regular army in Washington could not. They had defeated the most powerful army in the world. Andrew Jackson's victory in New Orleans sparked celebrations throughout the country. Ironically, the war had actually ended 2 weeks before the defeat of the Redcoats with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in what is now Belgium.
But the news arrives from the battle first. The news is Jackson has won. That's what Americans first hear. Next they hear, hey, the war is over. And if you put two and two together in this way, they think, my gosh, Andy Jackson won the war. And it's contributed a great deal to Jackson's subsequent reputation. He became known as the second George Washington. The first George Washington had achieved American independence. The second George Washington, Jackson, had confirmed American independence. For the rest of his life, Andrew Jackson was known simply as the hero.
Okay, we'll finish up here a little bit. But Jackson's reputation after the War of 1812 is tremendous. And we'll be getting into him pretty soon, how it leads him into politics briefly and then into the presidency. And he changes the presidency from a political point of view, similar to what Donald Trump is doing right now. Jackson wasn't the most polished politician, but he was very popular. And there's a lot of comparisons between Andrew Jackson as president and Donald Trump today. Okay, what we'll do then is we'll go to our next subtopic then, which is the Treaty of Ghent. The Treaty of Ghent. And as mentioned in the video, the Treaty of Ghent was actually signed 2 weeks before Jackson's victory at New Orleans, which tells you what? Well, yeah, both sides were eager to an end to this war, and I think more people saw it as a stalemate. And where was this treaty signed? In Belgium. So the word of Jackson's victory is going to get back the American people way before the news of a treaty. And so people assume that Jackson's victory is what won the war for us, when in actuality, the war was over 2 weeks before his battle was won. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th of 1814. December 24th of 1814. Again, 2 weeks before Jackson's victory at New Orleans. December 24th, 1814. Now, I want to just make a point here. You'd think when you negotiate a treaty, a lot of the treaty would have to do with why you went to war in the first place, right? It would address that. What were the 2 major reasons that we went to war with England? Freedom of the seas, and what else? That kind of ties in with that. What's that? Freedom of the seas. When they violated our freedom of the seas, what else did they do? At the same time, when they took our American ships, what else did they do? They impressed 7,000 American sailors. Those are really the 2 big reasons why we went to war. Neither of those 2 issues was even discussed in the treaty, which makes you kind of wonder a little bit, doesn't it? Well, anyway, the treaty did accomplish 4 objectives. The Treaty of Ghent did accomplish 4 objectives. What would be the obvious objectives? It restored peace between the British and the United States. Okay? Okay? It restored peace between the United States and Great Britain. Also, the treaty accomplished the release of prisoners of war on both sides during the course of the War of 1812. So, first objective is it restored peace between the United States and Great Britain. The second objective is it arranged for the release of all prisoners of war. The third thing that's kind of interesting, there was always a dispute over the border between the United States and Canada. We never really had a definitive border. Well, what the Treaty of Ghent did is it gave us a definitive border between Canada and the United States that is still there today. Okay? So there was a border that was defined between the United States and Canada as one of the objectives of the Treaty of Ghent. And the final objective, which seems a lot, but it's true, is the treaty actually improved relations between the United States and Great Britain. So the 4 objectives that were accomplished by the Treaty of Ghent is it restored peace between the United States and Great Britain, it arranged for the release of all prisoners of war, it settled disputes over boundaries between the United States and Canada, and it improved relations between the United States and Great Britain. Which takes us to our last subtopic, which is a turning point in American history for the United States. A turning point in American history for the United States. Basically what I'm going to tell you is this, kiddos. The War of 1812, the results of that war, marked a turning point in American history for 5 reasons. I'm going to give you 5 reasons why the War of 1812 marked a turning point in American history. Number 1, and Washington asked us to do this a long time ago and we never had done it yet, but we're going to. After the War of 1812, the United States finally developed what? A foreign policy. Are we awake today? Finally developed a foreign policy. Isn't that what Washington asked us to do? And we never had done it. We were always in a conflict with some European country because we had no foreign policy. So the first turning point in American history for the United States was after the War of 1812. The United States finally developed a foreign policy. The second turning point is the United States became more independent of Europe. We became more independent of Europe after the War of 1812. We became more independent of Europe. The third turning point in American history after the War of 1812 is the United States gained much respect from European countries. The United States gained much respect from European countries. How did we gain that respect, Carter? Why did European countries all of a sudden start to respect this United States of America? We beat, again, thank you. We beat the strongest country in Europe twice. Not once, but twice. We beat them in the Revolutionary War, and we beat them in the War of 1812. These two victories over the British gave the United States great respect from foreign countries. Finally. Okay, the fourth turning point in American history for the United States as a result of the War of 1812. This is a big one. For the next 100 years, from 1812 to 1912, during that 100-year period, the United States was not involved in any European war. For 100 years. Seemed like we were always involved. Weren't we in a European war up to this point? After the War of 1812, we are not involved in a European conflict for 100 years. From 1812 to 1912. What's the major conflict we get ourselves involved in 1912? World War I. Now we do get ourselves involved in a little skirmish, but it wasn't a European war. It was a war called the Spanish-American War, which took place in where? Caribbean and in the Philippines. Okay? But not a European war. Okay? And it was a very short war, a summer long. So, the fourth turning point in American history was for the next 100 years, from 1812 to 1912, the United States was not directly involved in any European wars. And the fifth and probably the most important turning point in American history for the United States is after the War of 1812. You know what we began to concentrate on? What? Ourselves instead of what? Foreign countries. Okay? We started to concentrate on what was going in the United States, not what was happening in foreign countries. You know why we were able to do that? Because we developed a foreign policy. Okay? So for the next many, many years, we began to concentrate on the United States instead of worrying about what was happening in Europe. So, the 5 turning points. Number 1, we developed a foreign policy. Number 2, we became more independent of Europe. Number 3, we gained much needed respect from European countries. Number 4, we were not involved in any European wars for 100 years. And number 5, we began to concentrate on our own country rather than dealing with foreign countries. Now, what's the only major war we're in from 1812 to 1912? The Civil War, right in our own country. You know, brother against brother, family against family, unfortunately. That's the war we're in. Okay, here's the plan. I'm going to show you some videos, another video tomorrow that shows you kind of live what the area looked like that Jackson fought in at New Orleans. And then we're going to have a review on Monday when we get back, and a test on Tuesday when we get back. That is the plan for AP US History 1, heading into December.